Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome in. Thank you for joining us for another Patreon Q&A. I'm here with James Intricasso and Matthew Colville to talk about this currently secretly named MCDM game. How are you doing?
Dale, do you know the name?
I do know the name. I'm not sure if I'm
Okay.
meant to know the name, but I know the name. So we've got a ton to talk about today, beginning with, we wanted to talk about the power roll. If you could just give us a little brief summary on how it works.
So the power roll is a 2d6 roll, and essentially we have three different tiers of results that happen. So what you do is you roll 2d6 and you add a modifier, and this happens whenever you are right now in the game making an attack, right, or using one of your abilities like a spell or a cool tactician thing that you can do. So you roll your 2d6, you add your modifier. There are three tiers of outcome, and there is basically like an okay outcome, a good outcome, and a great outcome. And the way it works is the good or the okay outcome right now is 7 or lower, right? The 8 to 10 outcome is your good outcome, and your 11 or higher outcome is your great outcome. If you roll a natural 12, right, boxcars on 2d6, you also score a critical hit, which means you get to take an extra action that turn. But you got to roll the boxcars to do that. It's not just any old 12, right? And what this has allowed us to do is it has allowed us to get more granular with the results. There were a few things happening that we saw from the patron feedback in our playtests and that we saw ourselves playtesting along with our internal testers, right? And it was basically that, like, when we were rolling 2d6 and that 2d6 roll was for damage, it meant that a lot of damage was ending up being this feeling very samey, and it didn't make much sense that, like, a kobold was rolling 2d6 for their at-will attacks, and so were the adventurers, right? And so maybe was an ogre. And we were trying to use more dice to impact dice and boons and banes and things like that to offset that. But people were still really mostly feeling like, oh, I'm rolling 2d6, and I'm basically always dealing somewhere between 9 to 11 damage, and it feels like the damage roll doesn't really matter, and it feels like the roll has no outcome on the effect at all. And now this actually lets us be more granular with those things, right? So we can have more varied damage at each of these tiers, and we can also have a varied effect. So if you're using, an ability that pushes somebody back, right? It might be that at the low tier, you push them back 1 or 2 squares. At the middle tier, right, you're pushing them back 3 or 4 squares, and then at the higher tier, maybe 5 or 6 squares, you're pushing them back, right? Or it could be an effect that increases. Maybe you're slowed at that lower tier, but at that higher tier, your enemy is dazed, right? And then they're dazed for a longer amount of time at the highest tier. So there's a lot of granularity we have there. We can make damage swingier or more reliable within different abilities. We can make effects swingier or more reliable in different abilities, and we can turn those things up and down. And that's just the start of all of the different things that we can do with this. Matt and I have talked about a bunch of different things. We've instituted it now with ability tests, right? Like characteristic tests, and how might it work there. So we're testing that right now. We're testing, like, how does it work when you do something like try to climb another creature? What does that look like? And so we're having a lot of fun with this. It's opened the design space wide. I know Matt used it when he designed the Elementalist, which he showed off on Patreon, and it really helped crack open the design of that, as well as many of our other classes.
Wilzard asks about what that might look like. Will we be getting multiple fail/success states, opportunities to fail forward? They say it seems dramatic, and I agree. I made a note here that it's a little bit like Indiana Jones failures, right? You can control it so that if you don't succeed at the jump, it doesn't mean you just fall down like a doofus. It means that now you're barely hanging onto the edge by your fingernails, that sort of thing. But where does that line of dramatic failures cross over into a lack of risk, especially in skill tests where hit points might not be on the line?
That's a great question, and some savvier folks may have associated these different levels of success success with a game like a Powered by the Apocalypse style game, right? Where you often see this, like, it's a total and complete failure in the lower tier. It's a mixed success, right, is what they call it, at the middle tier, and it's a complete success at the higher tier. And so for skills, right, like in combat right now, the way we've instantiated it is you're always doing something, right? And we still have that. So it's always like, okay, good, great. For skills, and when you're using your characteristics outside of combat, you do want that dramatic tension and the chance of failure, right? And what does failure mean? And so basically there are two sorts of difficulties right now that you can pick for your tests, right? And one is, hey, this test is challenging, right? Which means that it's a little easier than a severe difficulty test. So those are the two difficulties. I would say, like, easy and hard, right? But easy is not really, it's not easy, it's challenging, right? So that's all language we're still playing around with, and we'll see where we arrive with that. But essentially, right, it means that, like, on an easier test, you succeed when you get that middle or higher result, and lower means you fail. And if you get that third tier result, you succeed and something really good happens. You get like a boon, right? Like, hey, not only did I climb up, but I get to pull Dale's character up the wall with me, right? If it's a severe test, it's tiered in a different manner, where it's like you need the 11 plus tier to succeed, right? And you fail if you're the middle tier, and you fail with a consequence if you're at this lower tier. So then all you need to say, right, and that'll probably be written on a cheat sheet or the front of a GM screen, right, on your character sheet, and you can say to the player, like, okay, this is a severe test, roll. Right, and you can roll it up, or you can just say, make a blah, blah, blah test and keep the difficulty to yourself, but you in your head will know. So that way the player knows, oh, this is a good result, or like, ooh, I got an 8. I hope this is a challenging and not a severe test, right? So that's part of the fun and the tension that that is going to be worked out. Now, there are some scenarios and some specific tests where you do have that fail forward mechanic too, where it's like, hey, you still did the thing, but at a cost, right? You snapped the rope that you were climbing, so now no one can use it to climb up behind you, or you took a little bit of damage there, Indiana Jones, as you tried to roll out of the collapsing room. You scraped your back, that kind of thing.
I have a question here from Luca Mita. That is, and there were a few people asking similar questions as well. They're asking whether having different power roll tables for every ability risks too much clutter on the character sheet as PCs advance. What do you think about using props like cards to reduce the amount of things written down on the character sheet?
We just make the font smaller. No, we actually go ahead, and it is something that we consider. And it's funny, once we unveiled this, Lars, who is our producer on this project, right, raised the red flag of like, hey, we're trying to make layout templates right now, and this is going to take up a lot of space. Are we sure about this, right? So that's a thing we do really consider when we are working on these things. And Matt even mentioned it in the Power Roll post of like, does this mean that now there's less space for other things on your character sheet? It might. But we really believe in this, and it also... I think it has allowed us to come up with some shorthand that will keep each of these 3 lines on your sheet down to 3 lines for the most part. And so that part of it has been really rewarding and fun. And certainly this game has always had the possibility of like, maybe you could bring some index cards to the table that indicate your signature abilities and your heroic abilities, right? And here's a card that says your kit gives you a special power that does this. And here's a card that, hey, my magic item is on here and it gives me... Like, that has been a possibility for this game since before we instituted the Power Roll. So it's something here that you could definitely do. I don't know if we're gonna do it, right? But we do have the power for that, and you also have the power for putting some of these commonly used, if it stays a thing that we use for characteristic tests, right? Putting some of those commonly used things on the sheet, I think, is going to be really helpful for players. One thing that I'd love to do with the sheet is like put the conditions on the sheet and what they mean, so that you don't have to flip into the back of the book or ask the director on the back of the director's screen, like, hey, what does prone mean again? How does that mechanically affect me? Like, if that's right on your sheet, that makes a world of difference. So thinking about like how much stuff, how many pages should a character sheet be, and all that kind of thing. That is a big part of our presentation, is part of design philosophy that we think about a lot.
Yeah, at the end of the day, this game with only 10 levels, so people are right, as James said. Like Lars already brought this up. This is going to increase the number of lines. It's not clear to me that's 100% true, because before we were using natural language to describe stuff, and that takes a lot of words to do. It was kind of a hybrid of natural language plus the kind of algebra of how powers work. And now things are a lot cleaner, actually, because the power roll is doing a lot of that heavy lifting for us. But we were always going to have less space in this book than we have ideas. That's which we consider a good thing, right? Because there's only 10 levels, and there's a limit to the cognitive load. How many powers can a player reasonably be expected to keep track of in any given session? And that number, we don't know what it is, but it's not like 30, right? It's more than 2, right? But it's probably somewhere around 8, we think. We don't know exactly what the right number is. So those were already hard limits on what you could keep track of. And so I don't really think that the power roll is going to change that. It may be that instead of each class having, 5 powers on a page, there's only 4. But most classes were only going to be 2 or 3 pages anyway, right? So we don't think that's that big a deal. And we can also you can layer stuff onto the power roll, right? You can say here's each layer has damage and knockback, damage and the TN increases. And that lets us get really noodly with this.
Blood in chat says, a lot of this sounds easily solved by a good VTT. Any updates on that? And who am I to turn down an excellent segue? I believe that our producer out there, Jerry, has prepared, breaking news, has prepared a demonstration. Now tell me what I'm looking at.
You see the power roll?
Yes.
That was a power roll.
That's a power roll that Kobold made to push back an NPC character, right? So they move forward and they roll that power to see like, hey, I'm going to hit you, and I roll you back, and there you go. Boom, I want to move you in that direction, and I did. And that's how it works.
So that last thing you saw, that last thing was the where do you want to knock this person back to interface that came up. And that last thing that happened was that little arrow, and you could see the Kobold player's controller going, oh, I want to knock him back over here. So it already knows if they have knockback resistance, and it gives the attacking player the opportunity to decide, where do I want to hit this person back to? Very cool. We feel like this is already light years ahead of other software in this space. And that the defender didn't have to do anything because they didn't have a choice to make.
Yeah. And you can see the damage is automatically applied too, right? That the health bar decreases. The little 6 pops up because that's how much damage they take, and then they're pushed back. So it's pretty fun. They're almost pushed off the rafter, but not quite, right? Yep. So that's the other thing is like, oh, you can feel that tension of if they just rolled a little higher, that shadow would be sent flying over the side of that rafter down to the floor below.
Yep, and we don't. We were talking about this before the stream started, but like right now, the folks working on the VTT can implement our rules faster than we can. By which I mean, like, right now we're still building core stuff, which means it takes us a long time to figure out. It took us a year and a bit to get to this 2d6 power roll, right? Well, it didn't take them a year and a bit to implement it. It took them a couple hours. So there's hopefully, and we could talk about this too. Hopefully, there will be a point in the next couple of weeks. Certainly less than 3 months, but sometime in the next couple of weeks where you're going to start seeing a lot more content coming out of it. I don't know what the perception is from the audience. It certainly seems like there's been plenty for folks to talk about, but internally, our number one priority over the past several weeks has not been the game. Our number one priority internally has been staffing up. And that was a decision I made, by the way. We could have decided to keep hiring and game dev kind of co-equal in the schedule, but that would have meant that we didn't bring on new designers for like 5 months, right? And it's like, no, I made the decision. We need to prioritize hiring, because the sooner those new designers come on board and a new full-time producer, all of this stuff, the VTT and the internal development of the game, I believe, will accelerate rapidly. So be in anticipation of a lot more content coming really quickly once we're done staffing up. By the way, do not send us applications. That's not how this works.
I'm going to move on now to questions about the elementalists that we also want to talk about today. We read about the list of elements as it currently stands for the mage. I like mage. And
it's
your
more fun to say fire
of
mage.
arriving at that.
It's way cooler to be like, I'm a void mage, than it is to say I am a void elementalist.
When you look at the full spreadsheet you shared of the different, the 7 elements as they currently stand and ideas for powers attached to them, there were some examples in there of powers that have a name and nothing else. That idea of there is inspiration there. Who knows what it means yet? Things like the earth, my ally.
For me, the way it works is stuff like, oh man, what would be cool is if an earth mage could like summon a wall that like blocks line of sight and it can be destroyed, or maybe they summon an earth. Maybe it's not a wall. Maybe they summon an earth elemental, or maybe they can like cover themselves in rock, and all those are using the earth to defend myself. And so I give it a name, the earth, my ally. I'm like, I'll figure out what that does later. I got a lot of options, right? But you start with one of the nice things about working on the Elementalist, once I knew what the elements were and what they stood for, was how inspiring it was. Like the idea that water represents change, any number of things. And then that led me to thinking that maybe a water mage is a kind of leader. If the water mage can change the target of an attack, that's very much a leader style thing to do. Anyway, that's part of the fun. That your framework for design, in this case, the 7 elements and what they are, it's good if it's inspiring you to make stuff up, and you're like, oh man, what could? Whereas the other elements is like, fire is really inspiring, but water is not. Once you come up with like a tidal wave ability and maybe a rain type thing, after that you're stretching, and everybody knows it. They know when they read the powers. They're like, oh, they're grasping for straws because there's just not much you can do. Make a pool, I guess, with difficult terrain. Lots of people could do difficult terrain. Doesn't have to be. So that's where good design inspires you to create more stuff.
Yeah, that is a huge thing. That if one option is cool and the other options aren't as cool, the question I'm always asking is, how can we raise these options up to this level? Right? How can we make everything as cool as everything else? And that is a philosophy that I think has served us really well, not just in designing this game, but in designing like the Beast Heart and in designing talent powers. Right? I was looking at a guide someone made for the 5e talent today of like, it was a guide where they ranked all of the powers, and they were like, powers that are in red are trap options, and they're bad, and we don't like them, and like you shouldn't take them at all. And there were no options in red, right? It was just this. It was the
really
thing
cool.
They had created for other 5e guides that they were creating, and that was the system they had. And we didn't have anything in red, which made me very happy because we strive not to have that kind of thing. And so the idea of like, how can we sit down and how can we make water as cool as fire, right? I think is a question that people who have written fantasy stuff have asked themselves for a long time, and some people do and some people don't. And so that's a huge thing for us. And often when Matt or I am struggling with something, right? A big thing I learned from Matt is Matt will be like, well, hang on, let's throw this out and talk about how we could make this fun and cool. And so that we generally start there. And if we get to that place where the ideas are popping, it's like, great. Because what I would love is that we have too many ideas for water. We have too many ideas for the void.
Yeah.
And it's like, guess what? We can't put all of these in this book. And that's fine because we're going to make more books for this game. And those will end up.
We hope to,
Right. So
if people like the game, all we want to do is make more
something.
stuff for it. It seems very unlikely to me that you're going to get 10 levels of 7 specialization. Not impossible, but that would really surprise the shit out of me, right? So we're gonna have to pick of these 7, which are the ones that you can specialize in the core rules. Probably the big 4. What I said was it's N. We're gonna have N specializations, where N is probably 4 plus or minus 1, right? So you're gonna get some number of specializations where you can play a fire mage up to level 10, and then we'll make sure that let's imagine that there's no void mage in the core rule. That seems likely to me, but we want to make sure that there are some spells in here that are void spells so that players understand what's coming. And they're like, oh, I can see that there are 7 elements, but there's only 3 or 4 or 5 specializations. I can't wait to see what a void mage can do. Yeah, we feel the same way.
I don't know what a Memenek is. But based on context clues, I'm guessing that it might be an ancestry, and I would like to know more.
So, as many of you know, wow, look at that. So those are Memenek.
Yes.
Memeneki. So the whole idea is that our setting, Orden is one world in our setting. It is the kind of fantasy world, but there's other worlds. And some of those worlds are inspired by classic D20 fantasy stuff. Some of them, they can be anything. There can be a limitless number of worlds. Well, one of those worlds that we already know about is Axiom, the world of uttermost law, right? It is a world governed by the cosmic principle of law, not law with not like rules, but like cosmic law. And the native denizens of Axiom, the kind of their version of humans, are the Memenek. These are not robots. They are machine people, right? No one created these things. They sort of, as much as anything can evolve naturally in a fantasy universe, these guys evolved naturally. Like plants on their world are not green plant matter made of chlorophyll. They have plants. They just look like they're made of glass and ceramics and maybe even plastics. So it's like everything a biological machine can do, these guys can do it. They just use different pieces. They use different materials. So they're not made. They're not like Warforged where somebody made those things. The way you make Memenek is a mommy and a daddy Memenek love each other very much. And that's where baby Memeneks come from. And these are Grace's exploration. That's constantly great.
Look, my eyes are bad. I wanted to get a good look.
That was awesome. That was Grace. We looked at a lot of different ref. Yeah, but yeah, Pedroia gets it's a timescape ancestry that I would very much like to see in the core rules. We sort of had a moment where we realized that we had an unexamined assumption, which is that we want to make sure that the ancestries you expect to find in a classic fantasy game, humans, elves, dwarves, orcs, halflings, are in here. And then there are ancestries that are relatively new on the scene, but we all kind of love, like dragon people. Like when I started in the 80s, you could not play a dragon person, but you can now, and people like that, and so do I. We have our own idea of what dragon people look like. It's not wildly different than the D20 fantasy version of dragon people, but it is uniquely ours. And so we were like, okay, cool. And we want to have some ancestries that show you what capital is like. Hey, look, here's tieflings. They're relatively common, or they're just devils. In our game, they're just called devils. In capital, they're much more metropolitan and they're used to the other planes. And so there's a whole district that is mostly populated by devils. And revenants. So revenants are popular in capital. There's still very few of them, but they don't freak people out the way they did. Okay, great, that's cool. We've now shown people, if that's all we did, we would show people, hey, here are the classic ancestries you're used to, and here are some cool new ancestries that are unique to this part of our world, but then we realized, hang on a minute, people have already seen devils. People know what undead look like. People know what dragon people look like. What's new? What new shit? When you open this book, we want at least one or two ancestries where you go, whoa, what the fuck is that? I've never seen that before. One of them is going to be the Memenek. We don't imagine that Memenek are going to be popular as in there's a shitload of them around, but we want to put stuff in there where you're like, whoa, what is this? And then you want to play it. You're like, so all we have right now are those concepts. That's not art. That art we just showed you is not art that's going to go in the book. Now other people are going to look at that and they're going to fully illustrate real characters, and that's what goes in the book.
Now, a lot of people want to talk about kits. People want to talk about kits as potential replacement for multi-classing and the way that you could create things like spell sword archetypes using them. People want to talk about how kits work with the power roll. Maybe they have their own power roll tables, or maybe they alter the power roll tables that come from other sources, or maybe it's different depending on the kit. The people, they want to talk about kits.
Well, I have kit answers for folks. So one thing that I think maybe has gotten into people's heads is that at the beginning of the process, when we unveiled kits, I had said this might be how we could do our version of multi-classing, right? And there's a few things that I think that has been taken and run with that, which is the first that is like, maybe that's not true anymore, right? That if we want people to be able to create a spell sword, then we would probably do that mostly in a class or a subclass, right? Yeah. To allow people to do that. Now you can take a caster kit that will give you a little bit of a caster ability and allow, if you are a tactician, right? Like you can do that. That is a thing you can do in our game. But you're probably better served doing it in a way that we would write into a class or a subclass, right? Like maybe there's a magic tactician subclass, right? That could be cool. Maybe there's a fury that as you build your rage, earthquakes and stuff happen around you, right? Like, so there are other ways that we plan on instantiating that. The other is our version, quote unquote, of multiclassing will never be as robust as what you find in D20 Fantasy, because it is so easy to multiclass in 5th edition D&D, right? That it creates problems for designers, and it's problems that we've dealt with for the last 5 years, right? And we don't want to create those problems for ourselves or for other people who are excited to design for our game, right? So we have it like designing the Beast Heart and the talent would have taken, I want to say, half as much time, half as many resources, if well, that's not true, right? We still would have had dope art, but half as many design resources and playtesting resources if multiclassing wasn't a thing. Because we had to be like, well, what happens if you take 2 levels of Druid and 18 levels of talent, right? Well, it could create this imbalance of, and so that creates a lot of issues for something that most people who engage with these games don't actually want to do. But it's a thing that you have to account for because there's the possibility, right? So that's what we meant when we said that. Now, in terms of kits affecting your abilities, they do affect your abilities, right? So the same way kits had a damage bonus, and they could affect your range and that sort of thing, they can still do that. And the way the damage bonuses work is they affect different tiers, right? We try to give some kits give you even bonuses across the board to things like melee weapon attacks, right? It might be like, hey, the Cloak and Dagger kit gives you +1 to damage all the time, whether it's ranged, whether it is melee, as long as it's a weapon attack, because we assume that you can throw the weapons that you're using in the Cloak and Dagger kit and you can stab with them, right? Hey, if you're playing the Panther kit, right, you have a big weapon, and maybe the way we do big weapons for some kits, right, is like it's +0 at the first 2 tiers, and then +4 damage at that highest tier, to represent the fact that, like, when you swing hard with these weapons and connect, you're going to connect in a devastating way, right? And that's only on melee attacks. Similarly, the sniper might work that way for ranged attacks, because when the sniper hits and hits their mark well, they do a lot more damage than a non-sniper would with a bow, right? So we can play around. It's actually opened up the kit design space quite a bit, because it means we can play around with, like, should it be consistent across the board, what you're getting in terms of a damage bonus with this thing? Should it maybe be that, like, hey, it's only at these tiers that your damage bonus is happening? So that's been really, really fun to play with. And kits still give you, bonuses to your stamina, bonuses to your speed, bonuses to range, and things like that are also all still part of kits. But when it comes to affecting damage at different levels, we now have ways we can play around with it. And that has been super fun and rewarding, because it opens up the possibilities then of different kits doing different things.
Final Pixel asks, I'm curious as to what mechanics during character creation could lead to deeper characters and relationships outside the more standard things in other tabletop RPGs.
You're going to see more of that come through right now in character creation. We're working on, like, your career, and what does that what is your past before you adventured like, and what does that mean, and how can we bring forth things that will encourage more role playing. So one thing we're talking about is, like, favors, right? That you can be rewarded with, but also you start with a certain number of favors that NPCs owe you. And you can, like, pool those favors together to be like, hey, this person owes me a favor, they owe you a favor. Let's call in a really big favor from this person, right? Like, we need an airship. They have an airship. It's not easy to get, but if we call in every favor we have, we're going to be able to borrow this airship so that we can go fight the, giants in the lightning castle. Right? Like, that's the kind of thing that I think is really fun and encouraging, because it encourages you all to say, like, how do we let's work together, let's pool our resources, and who are we gonna approach with these favors and say like, oh, look, I know this NPC. Oh, so do I. So let's go together, right? Remember when we were rewarded for that thing and it says on my character sheet that we all have one favor from Lord Kenway of Dalrath? Let's go cash in these favors and get the Hound of Dalrath on our side for an adventure, right? Stuff like that. That's a fun scene to go roleplay. You're going to see some other mechanics like that, right? Like we have mechanics for research and knowledge and things like that. But the other thing I'd love for careers to do is right now, kits give you a little ability that you can use in combat, right? If you have a shield as part of your kit, maybe you can shield bash somebody, or if you have a whip, you can, pull someone towards you with it. I want to do that same thing for careers, but with out of combat things. Hey, I'm an artist, and so I have this artist background, and that means that I'm really good at being an art snob, so I can appraise art and I can judge people's other art, but I can also use that in conversation to seem more interesting than I actually am, right? That kind of thing.
James and I both talked about the experience of playing Baldur's Gate and how all the NPCs you meet have some past, have some dark past that you're going to explore and unlock. And I tried to come up with a version of it for our game when I was working on the careers, which there's a whole post about. Like you could download it and use it if you want to. We threw it out. And one of the possibilities that could happen to you was that in your career as a soldier or working at this university or being apprenticed to this lore master or whatever, was you get a incident, some kind of thing that happened, the unique thing that happened in your past that is the reason Karlach has an engine in her heart. Even though we threw all that out, it would be nice if there was some element of the real rules that we will eventually come up with that allowed you to choose one of these, or maybe even choose to roll to see what it was. And I think incidents are an opportunity to involve other players. If I have this scar on my face and a bonus to it when I interact with people who know what it means, because I was in single combat with the commander of an enemy army during my career as a soldier, it may be that dude who gave me the scar is the same person that put the engine in your heart. But we didn't discover that until we sat down and looked at our characters and said, hey, I've got an idea. It's that soap opera plotting. It's that notion of that tragic past that's going to come out. That's a really fertile area, I think, for players to kind of link their characters together. Your character has this backstory that has a beginning, middle, and an end. Shit happened to me.
I think that's going to be cool as hell, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm really looking forward to seeing character creation as a whole. Someone asked me what I'm most excited for. That's what I'm most excited for right now. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions, and thank you, chat, and to the people on Patreon for giving me questions. Have good days, evenings, mornings, and nights.